When something tragic happens to a person, what are some ways that people typically respond? When we think about tragedy and we think about the Bible, there's one name that usually comes to mind from the Old Testament, and that name is Job. Job is often looked to as an example of how a godly person might respond when life seems to just completely fall apart. His day by day walk with God had built a strong foundation that allowed him to look past the physical, the emotional pain of the moment, and to look instead for the deeper spiritual meaning. If we take a look at Job chapter 1, beginning in verse 1, it says this: There was a man in the country of Uz named Job. He was a man of perfect integrity who feared God and turned away from evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. His estate included 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large number of servants. Job was the greatest man among all the people of the East. His sons used to take turns having banquets at their homes. They would send an invitation to their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. Whenever a round of banqueting was over, Job would send for his children and purify them, rising early in the morning to offer burnt offerings for all of them. For Job thought, "Perhaps my children have sinned, having cursed God in their hearts." This was Job's regular practice. There's some things we can learn about Job just from these first few verses. He was an upright man, he was a man of integrity. He feared God, which meant, of course, that he had wisdom. He had turned away from evil, and obviously in his own personal life, he had a thriving business. He had livestock and servants. He was prosperous. He had a large family. He was considered a great man, and he was concerned for his family's spiritual life. He was basically serving and acting as their priest. Now, if we think about some of the things, what is most impressive about Job so far in this account? Is it his wealth? Is it his faith, his religious observance? Why do you think the book opens the way that it does? Why is the stage set this way at the beginning of Job? Well, knowing what's to come for Job, these verses give us an important truth. And this is it: that I need to walk with God before trials come. I don't need to wait until tragedy strikes and then turn to God out of some desperate last act. I should be walking with God in the good so I can be prepared for the bad. So let's move on from Job's background that we've already talked about and see what happens in the rest of this account, picking up again in chapter 1 of Job, beginning in verse 6. It says, One day the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The Lord asked Satan, Where have you come from? From roaming through the earth, Satan answered him, and walking around on it. Then the Lord said to Satan, Have you considered my servant Job? No one else on earth is like him, a man of perfect integrity who fears God and turns away from evil. Satan answered the Lord, Does Job fear God for nothing? Haven't you placed a hedge around him, his household, and everything he owns? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and strike everything he owns, and he will surely curse you to your face. Very well, the Lord told Satan, everything he owns is in your power. However, you must not lay a hand on Job himself. So Satan left the Lord's presence. One day when Job's sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and reported, While the oxen were plowing and the donkeys grazing nearby, the Sabaeans swooped down and took them away. They struck down the servants with the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. He was still speaking when another messenger came and reported, A lightning storm struck from heaven. It burned up the sheep and the servants and devoured them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. That messenger was still speaking when yet another came and reported, The Chaldeans formed 3 bands. They made a raid on the camels and took them away. They struck down the servants with the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. He was still speaking when yet another messenger came and reported, Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. Suddenly a powerful wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on the young people so that they died, and I alone have escaped to tell you. What in the world is your reaction to this story so far? Is it amazement? Is it confusion? Is it a sense of awe? Is it concern? Does it just raise questions? There's some things that we learn about God and about his adversary Satan in just those few verses there. We learn about God that he was protective of Job and his family. He had put that hedge of protection around them. we learn that God has ultimate authority, that those sons of God had come before the counsel of the Lord. We see that God is sovereign. We see that God is aware and active in the affairs of people. And what do we learn about his adversary, Satan? Well, that he roams to and fro, that he wanders about, that Satan acts as an accuser, but also that Satan has limited power. He has to come before God to ask permission for these actions he's about to take. Satan, we also see, is insolent, and he's also a schemer. Satan's accusation was that Job was a fair-weather believer, that Job serves you, God, just because you're nice to him. Treat him differently and watch how he changes, was the accusation that Satan was making. Well, what happens next in Job's life was not caused by God, but it was allowed by God. God had given Satan a chance to prove his accusation. He allowed Satan to attack everything about Job except Job himself. Satan was allowed to destroy Job's livelihood, his prosperity, even part of his family. Now, because of who Satan is, what he represents, and because of his hatred for the things of God, these verses remind us that we must know our enemy. You see, Satan worked constantly against God and against his glory, and really his only retaliation against God is seeking the harm and destruction of us, of humanity. And we have to be aware of this enemy and his schemes and not to allow him to have a foothold in our life. So if we consider Job's situation, God may allow trials in our life, but those are for his purposes and they're for his glory. And that means that they will ultimately be for our best, even though we might not be able to see it in the moment. What was Job's first reaction to these series of tragic announcements that were brought to him? Well, if we continue on and pick up in chapter 1, verse 20, then Job stood up, tore his robe, and shaved his head. He fell to the ground and worshipped, saying, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will leave this life. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Praise the name of the Lord. Throughout all this, Job did not sin or blame God. Then continuing on in chapter 2, it says, one day the sons of God came again to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them to present himself before the Lord. The Lord asked Satan, where have you come from? From roaming through the earth, Satan answered him, and walking around on it. Then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? No one else on earth is like him, a man of perfect integrity, who fears God and turns away from evil. He still retains his integrity, even though you incited me against him to destroy him without cause. Job's reaction to these terrible series of events should encourage us as believers that we can be true to God regardless of our circumstances. Job said, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Now, let's think about that. Is that just a childish reaction? Is that just a naive reaction? No, because tragedy reveals the inner spirit of a person. In Job's life, even though the temporary was taken away from him, the permanent still remained. In good times, Job had cultivated a spirit of praise that allowed him to express that same devotion in the middle of calamity. If I was making up a religion, to be honest, I would certainly leave out a book like Job. It does not portray a very good picture of the life of a child of God, because it shows us the reality of undeserved suffering. We cannot simply say that God always blesses the good and always punishes the evil moment by moment. Every day we see good people suffering while evil people seem to succeed. But in case you're unfamiliar with how the rest of Job's life unfolds, in chapter 42, verse 12, we find what happens later on. It says, so the Lord blessed this last part of Job's life more than the first. You see, Job ended up with more of everything and everyone that he had had before, from what was taken away from him. As we look into the New Testament, it takes the whole matter we find in Job so much farther. We see God involved in human suffering. God comes to us in the person of his rejected and brutally murdered son, Jesus. All of our angry questions and all of our angry challenges fall silent in the presence of Jesus on his cross as the crucified God. We may not find the answers we want in Job, but like Job, we have a question that's put back to us. Will I let God be God? Three things I want to leave with you as we end up this short study of Job. Number one is this, that we need to prepare for difficulty by growing strong in the faith while life is good. Second, we need to rest assured God will use any trials in our life for His glory and ultimately for our good. And then lastly, that we need to respond in the midst of trials in a way that brings glory to God. God is still worthy of our worship, even when bad things happen. His ways are higher than ours. He will cause all things to work out for His good, and these trials we go through will grow our faith. What kind of responses to trials bring God glory? Well, it's our continued worship, like Job. It's our continued trust, like Job. And it's seeking to learn from those trials and then to share with others how God is giving grace even through the middle of those tragedies. So my prayer today that you would find encouragement from this word, even though these are tragic stories, that we serve a mighty and a sovereign God who certainly knows what is best for us. And I pray that each of us would have the faith to rest in that assurance and to rest in those promises. And please don't wait for the hard days ahead to come before you turn to God. Begin that life of faith now so that you can be prepared for what's coming your way. You guys have a great day, and thank you for listening, and God bless. Goodbye.